Welcome to Defense Unicorns, a podcast for mission-focused innovators. We educate, inform, and provide mission heroes with DevSecOps, cybersecurity, and organizational transformation stories from the world's leading problem solvers. I'm your host, Rob Slaughter, and we're excited for you to join us on this journey. Welcome to this episode. Today we have Greg Kurtzer, an open source legend. He's one of the main contributors to CentOS, Rocky, Singularity, and is currently the CEO of ControlIQ. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm always blown away looking through your history of all the projects that you worked on. Can you talk to us about how you actually got started with open source software?
Sure. And all of the projects is just a figment of my age at this point. So I've just been around for a while doing fun stuff and having just great luck, honestly, just being with great people and doing cool things. How did I get started? Oh my goodness. So my background is biochemistry. And I was supposed to get my PhD, but I got sidetracked doing this open source and Linux thing, which I found to be more interesting than the science. And not in the sense that there was anything boring with the science, not at all. But I became just enamored with Linux, with open source. And part of that was because we were actually able to I was working at a young startup in the mid to late-ish 90s, and we needed to do some genomics research. And we were able to download this operating system over the internet, which at that point, if you remember, was like ISDN if you're totally lucky. Otherwise, it's dial up 56K or slower. And we were able to download the operating system, put it on a bunch of floppy disks, and install it to some random hardware. And we were creating scientific tools. Well, that completely changed everything about how I saw life, the universe, and everything, and decided, hey, this is so cool. I want to be part of that. And that was how this whole thing kind of got started and how I got involved and enamored by Linux and open source.
That's awesome. Was that actually the start of CentOS or what sort of came out of that?
Oh, that was even before CentOS. So yeah, this was like late 90s. So, young version of me. And I worked through some startups, some .coms, and I worked at a cool company called Linux Care that worked with some amazing people, developers, kernel people, operating system people that were there. Really, it just further inspired me and drove my passion for this. So I ended up landing then at the Department of Energy, where I spent then the majority of my professional career building high performance computing systems, which is basically what you can do with if you have a background in science and now an interest in operating systems. High performance computing is kind of like where it's at. And so I spent a lot of time doing that. But CentOS came out of that. So I was actually at the Department of Energy 2003-ish, 2004-ish, when CentOS came to be. And CentOS came out of another operating system that I was working on called Chaos Linux, CAOS. There was no H in it. The idea behind Chaos Linux was to create a community maintained RPM based distribution of Linux. And thus you can kind of see the relationship to CentOS.
Yeah, so talk to me a little bit about that HPC work. What is it specifically about HPCs that make it different or interesting compared to how people run standard compute for web applications or what I'll call basic standard of living type of use cases?
I love that. So, it's funny because I used to have a really strong and firm definition of what high performance computing was because I was, again, being involved in it kind of in the late, 90s, early thousands. To me, it meant something very specific for a long time. And I used to be one of those guys that would get into arguments about the meaning of HPC and what kind of systems and applications does that mean? And typically what it was back then was it was tightly coupled parallel applications that were extremely scalable, that can run across many hundreds or thousands of compute nodes, leverage all of their cores very efficiently, all the memory very efficiently, very well balanced and designed for these massive systems. That was high performance computing for me. Nowadays, high performance computing basically just means any sort of an application that's going to peg your CPU. or do something along those lines, or where it's just, it could be single threaded, single core. So it's not even the whole CPU. It's just like, well, if you can pin a thread, we're going to call it high performance computing nowadays. So things have definitely shifted, and they've shifted a lot. Now, when I first got involved with high performance computing, it really was, I mean, we were making these very tightly coupled applications and these specialized systems to drive these tightly coupled applications. And these systems that we leveraged were basically, the foundation was a architecture called the Beowulf. And the Beowulf it's a way to build high performance computing resources in a very scalable and pretty easy to maintain sort of architecture. And there's a number of kind of facets to what it means to be a Beowulf style architecture. Everything from, the layout of the architecture, the networks, the file systems, using commodity hardware. And it was specific. It's commodity, right? Nothing kind of specialized, because at that point we were kind of breaking away from mainframes and big iron. So anything that's kind of very specific commodity. It also specifies a freely available operating system and freely available software stack. So Linux really lended itself very well to this sort of an architecture. So the Beowulf for high performance computing really just took off. Lots of systems all over the place started using it. And we got to the point where, I mean, if you look, nowadays and even a decade ago, pretty much every single system on the top 500 is a Linux Beowulf. Now, we've done a lot to expand the Beowulf and make it more capable and more scalable, but that's the base architecture that we've been using. And to be clear, the Beowulf is 28 years old at this point. So it's a little long in the tooth, but it's also solved the problems that we needed to solve extremely well, over that tenure.
Yeah. So, 2003, 2004 timeframe. Were you still working at the DOE at the time, Department of Energy? Okay.
Yep. Yep. So
So,
I started in 2000 and had about 18 years at the DOE.
wow. Wow. So, talk to me about starting an open source project inside the federal government.
Oh, just starting an open source project is one thing, but doing it within Department of Energy. So that's changed quite a bit from when I first did it. The first project I did was back in 2001 called Werewolf. And it is a cluster management system, which still exists today. And I still run the project today. And that started 2001. And it's actually some funny stories. I hope I don't get anybody at the Department of Energy in trouble. But so DOE labs typically are governed by, when you're talking about licensing and IP and whatnot, a group called the Technology Transfer Department. And tech transfer just literally was like right down the hall from me in this one building that I was in. So it was real easy for me just to walk down over there and just say, hey, this is what I'm doing. What do I need to be thinking about? What do I need to be doing? And they basically said, yeah, you can pretty much do anything you want, open source wise. This is going back again to 2001. They said, pretty much do anything you want. Just don't make it an official DOE project. Just go off and do it. I said, okay, cool. So I just put it out there. And it wasn't long before tech transfer and Department of Energy wide, as well as that lab was run by the UC Office of the President. So UC Regents got involved before open source started to get a little bit more carefully defined on how do we actually do this. And it's not just start running with code and start giving that to the world. So there became more and more hoops to jump through and more validations to go through. But the Department of Energy's primary mission or one of their primary missions is to help encourage growth and support and innovation through the commercial sector. So we exist, in a matter of speaking, I mean, not only to maintain the nuclear stockpile, but also, and all the weapons that come out of that, but also we exist basically to help commercial industry. And so there's a lot of support within the Department of Energy for doing open source. Their preference in favor of licensing has changed a few times over the years and gone back and forth. Early on, it should be GPL. Then later it should not be GPL. Then it should be GPL again. And then I think the latest one was, please don't do GPL. So it kind of, and now they actually for the last decade or so, they actually have their own license. Actually, it may even be more than that. which is a derivative of the BSD license. So I'm very kind of still, it's just enrooted in me to use the BSD license whenever I can. More specifically, I should say non-copyleft licenses whenever I can.
Yeah, absolutely. So after Werewolf, what was your next project?
The next project after Werewolf was Chaos Linux, which then kind of morphed into CentOS.
Okay. And so talk to me about those early days, sort of what it took to get started, or were you able to just start it without asking for permission?
So there's actually a very funny story here, which I don't talk about very often because most people don't look at it from a federal perspective, but I think you'd really appreciate this. So I don't know. I don't know if the audience is very familiar, but there was another operating system called Fermi Linux. And Fermi Linux came out of Fermi National Lab, which is under Department of Energy. At about 2003-ish to about 2003, Red Hat went from having Red Hat Linux, which was freely available, right? Red Hat Linux 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 were all freely available. You can go do anything you want with it. They all have proper, lifespans. They were maintained by Red Hat professionally. And if you needed support, Red Hat was there to help you. They introduced in 2000, I think it was 2003-ish, they introduced Red Hat Enterprise Lite. For some reason, as I recall, and I could be off on this, but I'm pretty certain they started with version 2, not version 1, version 2. And so RHEL 2 kind of came into being. And RHEL 2, if I remember correctly, was based on Red Hat Linux 8. And then RHEL 3 was released shortly after and based on Red Hat Linux 9. And I could be off on that. So if there's somebody who wants to put out a comment on that, I'm going way back in time. And so I might be off on the versions, but the gist of it was that Red Hat Enterprise Linux just kind of came to be. And they had a very strict licensing in comparison, or rather a EULA, in comparison to what their previous versions of Linux looked like. So they stopped doing Red Hat Linux. They start doing Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Now, all of the labs at this point was pretty much standardized on Red Hat Linux at this point. My background was actually in Debian. And so I was actually much more of a Debian fan, and I knew Debian much better than I knew Red Hat at that point, or any of the RPM-based distributions, which at that point was like Caldera, Mandrake, Red Hat. I mean, there was a whole bunch of them. Coral, there was a whole bunch of them. But my background, again, was kind of in Debian. So when the lab said, we want to, we're standardized on an RPM-based distribution of Linux, and we're all tooled up for that, my thought was, well, I don't like that these aren't community maintained. So I wanted to kind of create a Debian kind of project around an RPM distribution of Linux. And that was the goal of Chaos Linux. So Chaos Linux started, 2003-ish, when Red Hat was kind of starting to, right before Red Hat end of life Red Hat Linux, but after they created Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So Chaos Linux existed. We were doing all of our build infrastructure. We were kind of building packages. We were assembling. A community was growing. I missed a key part, which is what you were actually asking me about. And I just always digress into talking for a while. You asked me, so I'm going to go back a little bit. You asked me about what was it like kind of at the lab and setting that up. When Red Hat first announced that they were going to end of life Red Hat Linux, which all of the labs have pretty much standardized on, it left us all kind of without a proper operating system. So I proposed to the CIO of Berkeley Lab that all of the labs work together and we all back Fermi, and we all back Fermi Linux, because Fermi already had their own version of it. So we should all back Fermi Linux. That got progressed to not just a conversation with our CIO, but a group conversation with all of the labs CIOs. And here I am. Now imagine I'm still a pretty young engineer at that point. I'm nervous just talking to one CIO. And now all of a sudden I'm on a conference call talking with like 12 different CIOs, and all of their primary staff is on the call with them. So this was a big call. And the CIO at Berkeley Lab basically said, so we've got regarding this Red Hat, licensing issue, one of my engineers has a good idea on this and I wanted to, offer this up. So he hands me basically, pushes the speakerphone over to me. He's like, go. And I start explaining this. I start explaining, Fermi's been doing this for a while. We should all kind of gather together and we should support Fermi, let Fermi run with this. And that should be the DOE standard operating system. I don't know which CIO it was. I think it was Livermore, but he can come kick me later if I got it wrong. But he basically, after hearing my whole pitch, completely discounted the whole thing, said, how much is Red Hat Enterprise Linux? Let's just pay them. And so it didn't get very far. So I did tell Tech Transfer again. I went and told them, and I said, I'm gonna go ahead and do this because not everybody and not all the labs, including us, because we are Berkeley lab, non-classified lab, which means, we're not making giant, lasers and weapons and whatnot. So we actually don't have a huge amount of funding and money. So I said, I'm still want to do this. And so they gave me the thumbs up and they told me all the different things that I needed to do in order to do that. And when I pushed this out back into the Chaos Linux community, there was a lot of support. And that was basically the foundation of CentOS. But it had this weird kind of federal piece to it, which not many people know about. But it was kind of funny how quickly, if they just would have said yes, Department of Energy probably would have been the CentOS provider for the world. But it
Yeah,
probably wasn't so bad. It being not in Department of Energy.
so it wasn't inside Department of Energy, but a lot of it was based upon the sort of bureaucratic sort of recommendation from the tech transfer side, but it was still very much supported by DOE individuals. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say it was supported by, because when I brought it back out into the community, there was not much of a Department of Energy team there. And Fermi Linux kind of already had their pathway, and they're like, well, this is how we're going to do this. And Connie and Troy at the time, they did fantastic at this. And I didn't want to do anything from a community perspective that may negatively influence the work that they were doing. So we said, we'll do this separately. Sometime in the future, maybe we'll come back together or come together and join forces, which actually did end up happening with Scientific Linux, which is the renaming of Fermi Linux. So there definitely was some collaboration there, but initially we kind of started separately. So I brought it back to the community. Now, just because of the circles that I was in at the time, there was a large contingent of that community, which was HPC. And so a lot of people, again, didn't realize how much of an HPC influence CentOS had at its roots, and very similar from the Rocky perspective, which I guess we'll talk about in a little bit or get to. But yeah, there was definitely a large contingent of HPC people. As a matter of fact, Rocky McGaw, who was one of the CentOS co-founders and the initial kind of lead developer of CentOS and the namesake of Rocky Linux, he was HPC. So he actually was CTO at a hardware integrator company called Team HPC way back in the day. And I met him and we would talk at various supercomputing events and whatnot. And we used supercomputing to actually pitch what we wanted to do to IBM at the time. Obviously, this is way before IBM had any inclination to purchase Red Hat. But we actually pitched this to to IBM executives. And their response was actually very favorable. They really wanted that. And that was part of the reason, again, why we ended up continuously just kind of moving on that and going forward. That pitch was done by myself, Rocky, and another member of early CentOS and a co-founder whose name was Russ Harold. Is Russ Harold still alive? Sorry. Sorry, Russ.
So talk to me about user adoption of like open source products, specifically around CentOS. Like at what point did it sort of start to explode?
Oh, speaking of supercomputing again, I don't remember what year it was now, but I was at a supercomputing event and I was talking with a hardware vendor. I don't even remember what hardware vendor it was, but I was talking with this hardware vendor and we were just talking about, the hardware and whatnot. And I had somebody come up, interrupt the conversation and say, when are you supporting CentOS? And that was the first time that actually I heard anyone ever say the word CentOS kind of outside of our circles. And it like struck me. I was like, is this for real? And someone else, I'm sitting here talking to this hardware vendor and somebody now is demanding CentOS for this. And just the irony that he interrupted us and was kind of, just bullishly just kind of butting in and taking the conversation. And then he kind of stormed off when they said, "Oh, yeah, yeah, we're definitely going in that direction." And the whole time I'm just sitting there with my jaw dropped going, whoa, what did I just hear? Because at that point, we started it. We had some inclinations that things were moving. But if you look at the early mailing lists that are archived, you're going to see there's not a huge amount of posts even and whatnot. So it was kind of very slow and quiet, and it just slowly started to pick up steam. And yeah, it was so over time, it got to the point where, yeah, and it was actually even rather uncomfortable that, if I went to conferences, I would actually turn my name around because I didn't want to be recognized. And yeah, getting people, maybe it would be different if I was photogenic, but when people come over and ask to take pictures with me and I'm like, oh God, that's going to be bad. It was very weird. So over time, CentOS and, you know, it just took off, but it wasn't a blow up. It was a very slow kind of progression and it just kept going and going. And I led the project for a number of years. Excuse me. Well, I wouldn't say years, plural. I led the project from initial stage to the point where another developer ended up kind of taking it and running with it. But yeah, it was a pleasure to be part of that project and to kind of see how that was born and to be able to recognize not only the things that we did right, but the things that could have done better. And then obviously leverage that later for another project.
Yep. So continuing on with sort of the transition, 2013 project gets started. Fast forward approximately, 15 plus years, and you start another project called Rocky. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about Rocky and the origin story there?
Absolutely. So again, this kind of happened around the notion of Red Hat end of lifing a project. What happened was, so after CentOS kind of kept taking off, I'm going to go back to CentOS real quick because it's very important and
Mhm.
relevant as we look forward. When we started building CentOS, there was not a huge amount of infrastructure, cloud infrastructure, and other things that we could be leveraging. There was no Kubernetes. There was VMs were still basically being used to how do you run Linux on a Windows box and how do you run Windows on a Linux box? And that was pretty much it. I mean, I think, you know, VMware was just coming out with a server product at that point, but it was very young. So if at all. So when we think about how to do this and how to actually, build packages from a distributed open source project in a way that we had to guarantee the security and integrity of those packages, the answer is, well, you only work with people that you absolutely can trust. So basically, it was the initial kind of founders and initial developers of the project that had the keys, the private keys of the kingdom for CentOS. So it was very small group. It started off, it was about, it was Rocky, and then we had somebody doing, different versions, different architectures. But in all, it was about 5 people plus or minus maybe two-ish at any given point. So it was not a large team of people doing this. So those of you who remember CentOS kind of being late on releases, late with updates, it's because the team was 5 people, basically carrying the weight of the entire community of CentOS users, which was massive. And this was not their full-time job, right? They had other jobs and they were doing this in their off hours and weekends and evenings. And in some cases, maybe sometime, during normal work hours. But for the most part, it was a labor of love. And these engineers just did such a tremendous job, really just carrying the weight of this for so long. So you can imagine about after a decade, this was getting a little, old and demanding on a lot of these engineers' times and whatnot. So Red Hat actually offered them jobs. And in part of that job that was offered to this team, they negotiated a way to bring CentOS into Red Hat and make this their full-time job. And then for Red Hat to offer some additional kind of resources and funding and support. And so that's exactly what happened. So Red Hat ended up acquiring easily, all right, air quotes, acquiring CentOS. So Red Hat acquired CentOS. When that happened, you can probably imagine the amount of phone calls and emails and text messages I got of people saying, uh-oh, Red Hat now owns CentOS. We need to go recreate a new version of CentOS. And my response was, let's not jump to conclusions. Let's see how this whole thing pans out. Let's see what happens. And it turned out, Red Hat, especially at the beginning, did a massive amount of help and support to the project. Once IBM announced that they were going to buy Red Hat, you can imagine all of my phone text messages and whatnot is all, blowing up again, especially this time from other hardware vendors that might be competing with IBM. We're all like, Greg, can you please go build another CentOS? And again, I said, let's not jump to conclusions. Let's see what happens. Now, jumping forward again a little bit, about 5, maybe 6 years, CentOS was end of life by Red Hat and to be pedantic on this, by the CentOS board, which Red Hat controls. I don't know if you heard that, but basically it was unanimous though, from what I understand. So they decided to end of life CentOS as we know it. Now, they didn't just end of life CentOS. They actually changed it in such a way, in a kind of interesting way, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But the operating system that pretty much everybody in enterprise that's kind of RPM based has been standardized on is now end of life. And we need to come up with, we needed a solution, right? So it affected us. It affected my customers. It affected the HPC community as a whole. It affected everybody. And so I announced that, I'm going to restart CentOS at this point. I didn't put it just like that, but I basically said, I'm going to redo CentOS. And if anyone's interested in this, please come on and join. Here's a Slack where I'm currently hanging out, and let's, introduce yourself. Come on over. That Slack blew up like beyond what you can probably even imagine. The velocity of people coming into that Slack made it impossible to keep up. So just to kind of put it into perspective, in less than 2 months, we had 10,000 new members. And out of that 10,000 new members, I think at least half of them started messaging me directly, which, and everybody had great intentions. How do we help? How can we be part of this and whatnot? And I'm literally watching my Slack, DMs just go up, and you've used Slack, right? So you just get all of these, red dots and whatnot of how many messages you have, and it's just climbing. And I'm just watching this going, oh my gosh, what is happening? And by the time I started the first one and worked my way down to the bottom, we were getting capped by Slack because we had over 10,000 messages already sent, and free Slack is 10,000 messages, a limit on that. So I saw that there were even like messages there, and I couldn't see them because when I click on it, it said you've extended past your, so it was booming so quickly, I couldn't even get to all of the messages. And it would take me literally hours to go all the way down, respond to people, go all the way back up, and just start again. I spent weeks just doing that and staying up late and trying to also organize what is the project going to look like? What the heck are we going to call the project? How is this whole thing going to fit together? How are we going to actually do something? Who's doing what? I mean, it was overwhelming how much interest and how much, support that we had from the community. Now, when I first thought about doing this, I thought about doing this as a project within my company. And what we saw is with the amount of people in the community that wanted this and the messages we were getting from the community, which is how can any commercial organization have so much effect over an open source project and open source community that the whole world counts on? We never want to be in a position like that again. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to be nuts if I'm going to put this in my company. I need to come up with a better way of thinking through this. And so we created the Rocky Enterprise Software Foundation. That was after we picked the name Rocky. So as I mentioned earlier, Rocky McGaw was one of the initial founders of CentOS. And he passed away right before CentOS was first released. There's even an email out there on the mailing list that basically says that he's done like it's either 95% or 99% of all of the work. It was right there. It was all done. And he passed away. he didn't get to ever see what CentOS was to become. And that bothered me a lot over the years. So when we were thinking about what to name the project, and I just kept saying, I don't know, I don't know. I'm not good with names, so I don't know. Maybe we'll think about it, or open to suggestions. Somebody asked me, kind of, Greg, can you tell us about the history of CentOS? And I started talking about this, and I was talking about Rocky, and it was like, boom, right on the side of my head. It's like, duh. You know what? This is the perfect opportunity to give credit where credit was due, to recognize Rocky McGough, but also I think it was a fantastic name. I think it is a fantastic name. Now, I wish the rest of the community agreed with that. For about a full year, we had people asking us to change the name. And we're like, yeah, we're not changing the name. The name means something to us. We're not going to change it. They're like, but it doesn't mean stability. It's like Rocky. It's like not stable. It's like, it also means mountains, which are really stable. So come on.
So talk to me a little bit about, Rocky as you guys are starting to build early releases and community adoption and, what has that been looking like, since it started?
So, oh my goodness. Well, one of the first things that we all wanted to fix was the development environment of CentOS. And again, that team did fantastic, but it was a small team. And that small team it limited additional involvement. It limited, the project really being able to grow and other things. And that just kind of became the culture of the project. Now, from our perspective, one of the first things that we had to do was solve this. And so we actually spent a good 4 months not actually building the operating system, but building the infrastructure to build the operating system. And we started with what Red Hat and Fedora uses, which is Koji is the name of the build orchestrator. So we started with that, and it took a while. I mean, it is very kind of custom for specific use cases and whatnot. And there obviously is a maintained open source project out there. There's not as much in terms of documentation as you might like for such kind of a big project, and actually how to do it. So it was difficult to get going. It was also difficult to build as a cloud native environment because it was actually built and designed for physical hardware. So physical clusters actually doing this. We don't have physical clusters. We have cloud instances. So that's kind of how we really wanted to focus on these builds. So we built this infrastructure up in the cloud. We built all of the sub pieces of this infrastructure. In parallel, it's not like we weren't doing anything on the operating system side. We had a team of people that were actually starting to look at all the packages, doing debranding of those packages, figuring out how do we properly build those in a way that's going to be compatible. What are things like the build order, the build requirements that are not there? And that's actually a really big key. The build requirements that aren't there. All right. So how do you build the operating system when you can't properly bootstrap the packages because the dependencies for those packages don't exist in the repositories which are being released? So we had to actually now either go build packages, or actually for the most part, we built them, but a lot of them we actually took from Fedora, older versions of Fedora or newer versions, depending on what we were trying to accomplish, and then backport older sources to that such that it is compatible with what we can see are the requirements to build the packages in Rocky. So it was a massive amount of work. Once we built that infrastructure now, it only took us about 2 months now to actually pump out the operating system. And that was a real testament to, how important that infrastructure is. Now, again, a lot of the package debugging and whatnot already occurred, but it gave us that infrastructure that we can just start throwing packages at it. And we end up kind of popping out the other side with ISOs, with containers, with repositories that are signed, all of that. Now, that was the first 6-ish months. The other thing that's really interesting is every single piece of the architecture, every single thing that is required, everything was built specifically for this purpose. We didn't reuse anything from any sort of commercial entity. We didn't reuse anything from, that already existed. We built it all from scratch for this purpose. And when we first started the project, clouds like Google and AWS immediately joined. And, we joke about this, but, they basically said, any amount of resources you need to go do this, consider it done. We support this. And all of the clouds said this. It wasn't even just like one. It was like everybody was like, we are supporting this. And if you go look at the Rocky Linux partners and sponsors, you're going to see that absolutely reflected there. And so this project was built specifically. Everything is in the community eye. Everything is completely transparent. Even our secure boot, we had to go do that as a community, not as a company. And so we've created kind of all of that infrastructure, all of those pieces from scratch. And so, yeah, it took us a little while to get everything released. And in end, it was 7 months in total, 6 months to get the first beta out, a month of testing. And then we released 7 months after we announced the project. It would have been nice if it could have been faster, but if you look at the amount of work that we did and whatnot, I'm very happy. The team just did so amazing. And to that point, what we created is probably the best example of an open source meritocracy that I think I've ever seen. Everything basically started from a huge influx of people, everybody asking, how can they help? But just a very smaller percentage of that actually just jumping in and doing it. And from that, naturally, so first we started in one channel. And you can imagine how crazy that channel was. You couldn't even keep up with it. It was scrolling so fast. By the time you finish reading it, it's like it's already scrolled off the page. So we broke everything out into dozens of channels, each channel kind of having a purpose and topic of what that team is supposed to be working on and supposed to be doing. And that now created kind of groups or collections of people that were interested in that aspect of the operating system. And just naturally, some people ended up kind of leading, some people ended up kind of doing development, some people ended up kind of focusing on documentation or the operations side of it. And the next thing we know is we actually have a complete leadership structure that just kind of happened. And it happened in such a way, again, it was a complete meritocracy because nobody knew anybody. Nobody knew their background. Nobody knew who they were unless people actually were sharing pictures, which nobody was. Nobody knew anything about. And people are using nicks for the most part, nicknames, not actually their real names even. And so it was a trip because when we first started doing video calls with everybody, we're like, oh, that's you. Okay. We didn't even know what anybody looked like for the most part. And so it was a trip, and it's just a project. Again, I think I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time to kind of get this kicked off, get this started, add my experience in terms of creating an operating system, knowing what some of the things we did right and some of the things we did not so right and could have done better on, and pulling all of that together to get this thing kicked off the ground. But I want to be really clear about something is, I joke about my age. I'm actually not that old, but I joke about it a lot. Obviously, I've got no internal issues with that. But as I tried to help the development team and the release infrastructure and the release engineering team and whatnot, I realized how dated my knowledge was from back when we did CentOS the first time. And the team that came up and took on this task is so amazing. And this team deserves so much credit. And it is a large team from a massive amount of different, sectors of the ecosystem and different interests and different backgrounds. And that team itself is just, it is amazing. And we actually do need to do a little bit better on the community side still. Even though we had so much and we have so much community involvement, we do need to get better at leveraging that community. And so that's one of the things that we definitely need to do better. We need help on that, but we also need people from the community to actually help us with that. And so that's my big call to action there. If there's anybody listening to this that wants to be part of such a group, such an organization, please just join. You just go to the website, click on the chat button, and you're going to go to chat.rockylinux.org. That basically goes to Mattermost. I think most people in federal DoD is probably familiar with Mattermost. It's basically an open source Slack alternative. And it's fantastic. And that's how we all communicate for 90%, maybe even more of all of the communication and organization that we have. So join, please, and be part of this.
Yeah. So talk to me about the power of self-organized teams, because I think that's very, you know, apparent as you talk about your success with these products, but specifically around, Rocky. What is it about self-organized teams that make them so powerful?
So I'm going to first answer this a little bit differently, but I think it'll explain everything. One of the problems that we set out to solve was the concern of a single organization or a single company being the primary driver and thus potentially the primary influencer and destructor of an open source project. So we wanted to figure out, how do we manage this? And we came up with a bunch of really good ideas on how to approach this problem and how to actually solve this. So we have all these different kind of teams. I'm the project director, and as part of my project or my team is the organization, the umbrella org that manages things like partnerships, sponsorships, the trademarks, to be blunt, the bank account. And that's kind of one side of the management. But now you can imagine there's an equal team, which is release engineering, developers, security, community. I mean, you start naming it, special interest groups, and we have all these different teams. Now, how we approach this is, I wanted to make sure that there was enough confidence in place in terms of the architecture of this organization that, I've got no intention to do anything negative to this. And as you can probably imagine, I mean, this is a lot of work and it would kill my reputation if I did anything negative. So I don't want to do anything negative, but I want everybody to be kept honest in this. So we created a series of checks and balances. So, and to be blunt, I mean, to be clear, CentOS was actually the Chaos Linux, which is what it came out of, was a 501c3 nonprofit. 501c3s do not protect projects, open source projects, very well. Not only there's a number of examples of how boards are manipulatable by bad actors. And you can do things like not require that the domain name for the project is in the project itself, but rather let's just give that to an individual to have, right? That was the problem with the CentOS, original CentOS board, or one of the problems with that. And then basically, if you don't own the domain, you've got no control actually of the project. So that was one of the big problems that we had. So we needed to come up with a way that actually is more resilient, where there's an emergency button, in a matter of speaking, where we can actually make sure that we can reel things in such a way to keep everything honest. And the way to do that is not to put it all on one person. It's not to put it all on one organization. It's to make sure you have a plethora of organizations supporting and driving that project, and individuals doing that. So stability in open source does not come from a company, a single company supporting that project. It comes from many companies, many organizations, and many individuals supporting that project. So that was what we set out to solve. We created this series of checks and balances. I cannot go and sell off Rocky Linux any more than the release engineering team can go off and sell Rocky Linux, any more than the security team or the community team. We can't do it. Plus, our sponsors are watching us. Look at who our sponsors are. Just look at the clouds, for example. We got Naver, we got VMware, AWS, GCP, Azure. Do you think any one of them is going to allow us to do something which aligns with any one of them? No, the fact that they're competing with each other actually makes it more stable, because they're not going to go for it. If we say, okay, well, we're going to bring this whole thing over into AWS, and this is going to become the new AWS thing, right? The other clouds are going to be like, yeah, no, right? That's not what we came into here for. And we can now help manage and maintain the stability of the project by all of the people, organizations, and companies that are actually now standing behind it. So all of this was done very deliberately to figure out what is the best mechanism to do that. And part of that is, we are not a 501c3. We are a public benefits organization, a B Corp. If you're not familiar with it, a B Corp can be for profit, but we have clearly stated in all of our documents, we have no intention of making product. And that's why we have, or excuse me, making revenue or making money. We don't even have a product that we're not giving away. I mean, we give everything away. And as a matter of fact, in our mission statement, every single piece of everything that's required for what it is that we're doing has to also be open source and giveawayable, if that makes whatever. And we've actually now had two other Linux distributions, Circle Linux, and there's one other that I'm blanking out on, that have actually now recapitulated what we've done from our documentation, from our source code, and from everything else. And they have respun another enterprise Linux variant. I'm not one for having a whole bunch of enterprise Linux variants, but I am one for saying, just in case we didn't anticipate something and something happens to us, I want to ensure that the community can go and pick up exactly where we left off. To my knowledge, there is no other project like that, with the exception of Debian, that can do that. And those of you who are like Arch Linux, yay, Gen 2 can do it. And yes, you're right. I'm not thinking of those. I'm thinking of really enterprise focused. And now I'm going to get them all saying, well, Arch Linux can be used in the enterprise and so can Gen 2. So sorry, my goal is not to piss people off, but to really just articulate how we're approaching this, I feel is unique to the enterprise Linux community. Let me put it that way.
That's incredible. So let's talk a little bit about ControlIQ and another open source project that you work with called Singularity.
Absolutely. So my background, again, kind of coming out of HPC, has been basically HPC almost my whole career, with certain bits and pieces that are kind of off, but still kind of with an HPC bend. Like, I'm interested in Rocky predominantly for my own personal interests because it helps compute. It helps solve computational problems. And I really like supporting people. And even our tagline is empowering people to do amazing things. That's what drives me. So when I think about how to do all of this, when I think about what's important and how are we going to actually bring this to market and how are we going to help people, we're like, well, what we know is software infrastructure. So we focus on that. So that's software infrastructure for high performance computing. Predominantly, that's what it initially set out to be. And the company was founded to do something kind of different, which is, I mentioned earlier that high performance computing is kind of the legacy architecture, in a matter of speaking. And I don't mean to talk negatively about the Beowulf. It's been tremendous for supporting science and for doing, building these amazing systems, but it is a legacy architecture. It is flat, it's monolithic, and it does not play very nicely with cloud, with orchestration, and some of the much more diverse forms of workflows and use cases that we're seeing kind of coming into HPC. So we were founded and funded specifically to solve that problem, to create the next generation of high performance computing infrastructure. We jokingly call it just HPC 2.0. And we were focused on doing exactly that when this whole kind of debacle with CentOS kind of came about, and we said, well, let's go ahead and help this. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of our initial goals was to put this into the company. And then we pivoted that when we saw how big the community was and all the interest that we had, we would be doing a disservice to that. So we decided to kind of approach this very differently. What we decided had the implications of that. I wish I can say it was completely all thought out and we're just that brilliant. But honestly, a lot of it came with, we started first with the ethos, with the goal of what we're trying to do. We lived true to how we think the ecosystem should run with regards to open source, how we think companies should interact with open source. And that was kind of our starting point. So to do that means, well, if a company is going to rely on a piece of open source software, first off, you already got my opinion on, what makes a stable open source project. So I would actually say, do you remember that old mantra, which is, if you love something, set it free, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of how we think of open source. We really love open source. We believe in open source. And when we decide to open source something, it's because we want it to be free. We don't want to hold it hostage. We want to make sure that the community owns it. The community controls it. And if it needs to make a left or a right turn and go a different direction, I want the community to be the one to dictate that, not my business model. So we put things specifically and purposefully now outside of the company. And I've learned lessons from this. I've tried it the other way. I completely, you brought up Singularity. I completely alienated the community when I created Singularity into the company that I had. The whole community of contributors and collaborators that we had just started kind of dwindling away because the company now controls it, runs it. And if you weren't part of that company, it was very difficult for an outsider to kind of be super involved. It was very discouraging for outsiders to be involved. So what I learned from that process is it's not the right move is almost never for a company to control an open source project. It doesn't matter if that's a small startup. It doesn't matter if that's IBM, and not to pick on IBM, sorry, but just as an example, it doesn't matter. It shouldn't be hosted by that company. And we firmly believe in that. So what this means is when we open source projects or we contribute to projects, we actually no longer want to put them within our corporate umbrella. We want to make sure they are outside of that. And this actually does something really good for the community. And again, that is our ethos. It basically forces us to make sure that we have a business model, which is not only ethical, but it also is guaranteed to add value because people don't need it if it doesn't add value. It's so simple. So if somebody wants to go use Rocky Linux, we actually encourage that 100%. We want the whole world using Rocky Linux and leveraging that and knowing that that is always going to be stable, safe, and a fantastic foundation for them. Now, if they need something else, if they need help, if they need support, if they need additional features, values, we actually spent a long time actually talking with customers and customers of competing Linux distributions. What do you like about your provider? What do you not like about your provider? I also have 18 plus years of experience as being a customer of another Linux distribution, right? Red Hat. And I know firsthand the things that they do really well and the things that they don't do really well. And again, I'm going to keep drilling on this ethos because if our goal is to help people, help teams to do amazing things, well, we shouldn't ever be pushing a business model that is not helping them on that vision. And if we are, for example, here's a super easy one. Your background with a federal agencies is probably very similar to mine. Do you ever want to count systems and then pay on a per system basis on how many you have? Does it ever make sense?
Rarely.
From a customer perspective, it makes almost no sense ever. From a vendor perspective, oh man, is that advantageous? And that's why you see it over and over again. So from our perspective, we're like, that doesn't satisfy the needs of a customer. It satisfies the needs of a business requirement of the vendor. So let's think about this differently. Instead of charging by node, let's do something really novel. Let's actually just be the support escalation team for either an individual or an IT organization or whoever it is. And we become their escalation team. I don't care how many nodes they have, how many hosts they have, how many containers, VMs, or cloud instances they have, right? Their job is on the line. And we are there to make sure that their job is done successfully and for us to help in any way that we can, for us to be a resource for that person, not a resource for that instance or that entitlement or that core. So we kind of completely flip the whole support model upside down by doing this. And it's a super simple idea, right? I don't know why nobody else is doing it. I don't know. Maybe we'll find out later that we're just stupid. But everybody so far that we've positioned this to is like, yeah, we love this. This is fantastic. So we're like, well, great. This works for us better as well. So things like that, we're adding value and we're making that value direct for the customer. And we're also adding additional capabilities. So for example, again, nobody wants to count systems, but people need help doing patch management, updating of systems, ensuring systems are being properly updated and whatnot. So instead of like a satellite type service, we're actually doing something called a repo as a service. And repo as a service is a way that we can guarantee SLAs on package updates, security updates, make sure that customers always have the latest and greatest, always have exactly what they need, make sure that repository is being maintained. If they need any changes to the operating system, we can either, whether they're doing the changes or we do the changes for them, we incorporate that into their repository for their organization. So whatever they need, that Rocky Linux Foundation is just that. It becomes their foundation. And we are now providing a tool, a service that absolutely makes it easier for the organization. So our goal, again, is to add value. And if we don't add value, don't use us. If somebody doesn't need what we're offering, don't use it. Go use the open source, go use the community. And that's the coolest thing ever from our perspective.
That's awesome. So talk to me a little bit about the role of federal government or, both the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and, pretty much everybody else. Yeah. What is the role of the federal government in regards to open source software?
Well, I could tell you with Department of Energy, because that's again my background. It's silly for me to Department of Energy to ever develop software code that is not open source. It should be always be open source, and everything that we can, we should be making it like religious in terms of releasing that code back out to the world. At the end of the day, it is the taxpayer dollars for the most part that is funding everything that we're doing, and we should be giving that back to the community. And I'll even go a step further. We should be giving it back to the community in a license in which they can do whatever the heck they want with it. And I love the GPL. I think, and copyleft licenses, I think they definitely have a role within the community. But I will say the viral nature of copyleft actually makes it very difficult for companies to actually incorporate that value back into the IP of the company. And it actually puts the company at risk. I've now seen this happen several times, and we just went through an audit as well on our source code to make sure that we are not tainting anything that we're building with a copyleft license that would potentially, again, jeopardize our products, jeopardize what it is that we're doing in a negative way. So I do believe that federal organizations that are writing software to the greatest extent possible should be contributing back to open source and should be making those changes back available. And to that point, again, not to make this a CIQ plug, we do have federal customers, and these federal customers are actively asking us for additional features. As we're adding these additional features, we almost always push 100%. As a matter of fact, I can't even think of a situation where we're not pushing things back into the community, back into the open source community. So even if we are being contracted or leveraged to further extend or develop features, we put that back into the open source community. One that I can think of that we're not right now, just to kind of balance this, is we have a number of federal contractors or federal organizations that are asking us specifically for FIPS compliance, as well as other security accreditations. The process of FIPS compliancy actually is extraordinarily complicated and expensive. And so what we are going to be doing is we are going to be licensing the FIPS compliance pieces under a contract. And part of that is also because it's actually very difficult to re-release those back into the open source community because we actually have to make changes. When we talk about compatibility with upstream enterprise Linux, there's several different pieces to consider. There's bit for bit compatibility, right? Is it the exact same source code and same patches we're using? And then there's bug for bug compatibility, right? Are we so compliant, even though if we may have had to make changes or we did things different, is it so compliant that a bug you see on one, you should expect to see it on the other? And we are going to have to change the bit for bit compatibility quite a bit in several areas. The FIPS level of compliance that we're going for is 140-3. That process is absolutely underway, and we are already making changes to that, but those changes are not, they may not be reflected 100% upstream yet. And we're trying to figure out the best way of doing that and the best way of figuring out how to manage that. We are definitely going to offer them back up to the community, but because of the process of how Red Hat kind of runs and governs what's going into CentOS Stream, we actually don't have direct control over what happens there. And so we're going to do the best we can on that, but we are going to be licensing those binaries as part of our license ultra secure stack. We also have a way of blocking buffer overflow based attacks through a partnership we have with a company called RunSafe. And RunSafe has figured out how to block buffer overflow vectors on embedded applications. We have worked with them to be able to apply that to the entire operating system. So imagine now your entire operating system, especially as we're thinking about things like supply chain security, and it applies whether you're physically installed running on a cloud instance or in a container. We can actually block buffer overflow based attacks, which is about, I'd say, somewhere between 40 to 60% of every critical CVE that comes through the pipe. Every critical security issue is based on a buffer overflow vulnerability. So we can't stop the buffer overflows, but we can definitely stop them from being used for malicious purposes. So things like that, we're adding value again on top of that open source base. And we're hoping it's enough value that people come and want to do business with us.
So, a follow-on question in regards to advice for the folks listening, for the people who are running their own small teams of organically led, whether they're actually software products or just organizations that are focused on innovative efforts. What advice do you have for those teams that you maybe wish you had yourself back in your early days?
Challenge the status quo. Just because we have been doing something in a particular way is not good justification for why we need to continue doing it in exactly the same way. Um, not to sound like an Apple fanboy here, but think out of the box, think differently. and try to see, is there a better way of doing something, and challenge it. If it's not, challenge the expectations that we have out there, right? And again, if you are a vendor and you see something that is not working for a customer, not working for people, I would suggest challenge that with your organization. Do the best you can to help everybody be successful. And that, to me, at least, is what drives me. So that's what I would recommend, of course, for other people.
That's awesome. And then last question for you. You are one of our first guests on this podcast, and it's been an absolute honor hosting. You're, obviously well known. You're a legend within this small niche community. And one of the things I want to ask you is, why should folks who are listening continue to listen to this podcast?
Well, a couple good things come up for me. So first off, it used to be said that flattery will get you everywhere. I'm not sure with me, because I think it makes me self-conscious and whatnot, but I appreciate it though. Thank you. But there's a lot of I've been just lucky, is really just lucky, right in the right places, right time with the right people. So far, the podcast and the interaction that we've had has been not only just fantastically fun and interesting, and of course, well, I guess I'm a biased participant regarding the interesting side, but it's been a lot of fun, and I would love to see this podcast, especially as it pertains to kind of federal and vendor kind of alignment. By no means limited to that, of course, but to my knowledge, there's nothing else that's really hitting on that. I think your connections, your background, your experience, and the things that you bring to the table to really drive an amazing conversation, I think is a perfect mix for the podcast. And I really appreciate being a participant of that. So thank you very much.
No, absolutely. I'll make sure not to compliment you ever again. But it's been really okay having you on the show. It's been fantastic. Like I said, I really appreciate you taking time, and thank you again.
Absolutely.